Hello, everyone. Welcome back to St. Louis Teens, and welcome back to our series on Voices of Peace and Justice from Ferguson to Minneapolis. Today, we are here with Missouri State Representative Rasheen Aldridge, who played a prominent role in bettering our region after the civil unrest in Ferguson and continues to serve our community not only as a member of the Missouri House of Representatives, but also as an eminent leader in organizing several peaceful protests in St. Louis. Representative Aldrige is well known in the community for his voice against racism and for policies supporting businesses and economic empowerment of our struggling community. Thank you for being with us today, Representative Aldrige.
Thanks for having me.
So, Representative Aldrige, we are so excited that you're a Parkway West alum and wanted to ask what inspired you to go into public service and how has your journey been?
Yeah, so I'm glad to be a good Parkway West alum, class of 2012. Shout out to all the young folks at Parkway because since the Ferguson uprising, I've been seeing and been encouraged by fellow young people at Parkway that's either been taken to the gyms and doing a walk out and walk around the gyms, or just recently last week where there was a protest outside of Parkway West where you had West students, Central students, North students, and teachers coming around talking about how we need to make a change, just not in our criminal justice system, but also in the Parkway curriculum and the policies that's taking place. So for me, I guess my activism started at a very early age. On the right side of my leg, I was born with one leg shorter than the other. So I was trying to come out butt first, already telling the world to kiss my kind of rear end. But, living in the city, and then actually, I would say Parkway had a big influence on it outside of my mom, having me engaged in community events locally in the neighborhood, back to school drives, Thanksgiving drives, and Christmas drives. But for me, at an early age, I always felt like I had these special lenses on of living in the city in an area which, had high crime, high poverty, low wages, no community center, no really community playground. But and then going to Parkway and seeing totally two different worlds, not really understanding why. And I enjoyed it. I felt like when I went to Parkway, the grass was greener, the air was more tastier, and it was just a lot more stuff to do when I went over my friend's house when we would hang out. But I never really understood how, where I went to school at, I didn't have those same opportunities back home. I always felt like kind of like an animal in a cage. We didn't have community centers. We didn't have gas stations we can walk to. It was just a total different environment. So I never really thought that it would be politics or community organizing, but at that age, I wanted to make a difference in making sure that my neighborhood had those same opportunities as the neighborhood that I went out to in Parkway area. So I always had these special lenses on throughout my education career, wanting to see the same beauty, the same opportunities that Parkway had or the Chesterfield area had that hopefully my neighborhood down in the Fifth Ward could have as well.
And I know it can be difficult, but if you had to sort of pick one part of your job that would be your favorite right now, what would it be?
One part of my job that's my favorite, I would say when I get the opportunity to be able to talk to other young people like yourself, other young people that look at me and be inspired of some of the things that I accomplished at the age of 26, and let them know that, this can be them too. Sometimes we don't know the roadmap, which after high school when I started doing community organizing, I didn't know the roadmap that it was going to be. I just wanted to make a difference and want to make a change, if it was with the Fight for 15 or trying to pass Medicaid expansion. But I love being able to talk to my fellow peers, because it is our time right now to take the world and shape it that we want to. And we always hear from our elders, it's your time, you're the next leaders. But sometimes they don't want to pass that baton. So, letting young folks know some of the obstacles that I went through and still go through as being a young elected official. When people think, you don't have too much experience, being a young person who sat on the Ferguson Commission and got to meet with President Obama back in 2014, I never would imagine being somebody who just grew up in North St. Louis that these great milestones would potentially be something that I accomplished. So being able to talk to other young people and give them hope and give them that same excitement when they look at me, give them that same excitement back within themselves, to say that they can be the next Rasheen Aldridge, they can be the next whoever they want to be. And it's just a matter of, it's hard work, and it's determination, and it's a lot of doors being closed and us not being at the table. But sometimes we got to kick the doors down, and sometimes we got to bring our own table or our own chairs to the meeting to make sure that we're part of it. So I love being able to talk to other young people and give them inspiration and hope that, we can build this movement together. And there's many of me's out there that can be state rep or city council member or school board member at a young age and don't have to feel like, oh, just because I'm young or I don't have a college degree yet, I'm still working through it, or I haven't been doing this for 20 years. They have a very important voice. Young people's voice is very important, especially as we talk about moving forward and shaping the way that we want our communities to look like, we want our state to look like, the way we want our nation to look like.
And I think it's definitely inspirational what you have been able to accomplish, not only to all the people and students who are at Parkway West right now or are graduating Parkway West, but to Parkway as a whole, for you to go into public service and to have this sort of success in that field at a very young age has been an inspiration to not just me, but I know everyone throughout Parkway. I did want to ask, with the recent death of George Floyd and the movement in our country, how do you think peace can best be restored during these difficult times?
Yeah. Here we are again. I remember when I seen the video of the officers at the one time. At first, it was just officer that had the knee on the neck, and then we later seen that there's actually two other cops on George Floyd's body outside of the one that was standing up. When I seen that, it brought back a lot of trauma from Ferguson. It brought back a lot of pain. It brought back a lot of here we are again. It brought back thoughts of how will the family, knowing how Leslie McSpadden, Mike Brown, mother, was in so much pain and so much saddened to see her son leave. It brought back those emotions of, the George Floyd family won't have him for the 4th of July, or they won't have him for Christmas anymore. And that's tough, no matter what policy change come out of it, what civil rights or civil case come out of it where the family may get money. You can't replace a body. And that's one thing we say during the protest when people like to talk about the buildings being burnt or some looting happening. You can rebuild a storefront, you can kind of rebuild a community, but you can't bring back a body. So right now we talk about peaceful protests. And I tend not to use the word peaceful because the reality is the people in the streets, even including myself, are pretty angry. They're pretty upset. They're pretty pissed off. And there's not peace in the streets because people are sick and tired and they feel like enough is enough. What I'm hopeful, though, from the constant organizing you're seeing in St. Louis, Minneapolis, Atlanta, the constant disruption and making people feel uncomfortable and cause attention to, honestly, a situation that's been going on in our world for decades and generations, even before my time, is that we're really getting to a point now. And I think, the Ferguson movement, we had Trayvon Martin, that was right before Mike Brown, but, it really took for Mike Brown to be the epicenter of these police-involved shootings. Eric Gardner died before Mike Brown, but it took his death and the young people taken to the streets to kind of uplift Eric Gardner's situation. And then they started protesting. And then so many other names from Sandra Bland and Tamir Rice that was killed. But what I see differently in this movement is, it took time to build a foundation and a roadmap for people to see what is going on in America. There's so much data and statistics out there when it comes to people of color and the relationship between them and police that we're really at a point where we can create some feasible policies and not tedious change, some dramatic change that is really going to, have communities feel like they can walk down the street and not get harassed, or have communities feel like, they have livable wage jobs in their neighborhood, that they have quality education, that they have access to healthcare. Now, what you see since the George Floyd death, and more massive numbers even in St. Louis are coming out than they kind of did in Ferguson or Stockley case, is you see elected officials, you see community leaders, you see corporations now speaking up and saying what happened wasn't right, which we did not see as much in Ferguson. There was a lot more pushback, even from the media. And that tone has really shifted from Mike Brown, the Ferguson movement, to the death of George Floyd. So as a young person, I'm always hopeful and optimistic that, change is going to happen. But I would say since my time of graduating and being involved in the different movements, from the Fight for 15 Ferguson movement, the Stockley uprising in St. Louis City, and now to George Floyd, that we're on to really creating some concrete policy change and changing the idea of what it means for public safety, or when people say defund the police, not mean abolish, but how do we take money out of our public safety budget? When you look in the city and county, is majority of the budget. How do we take some of that and reimagine or reinvest back in communities that need it the most? So I'm very hopeful that what you're seeing from these protests will ultimately create some substance policy change where when these situations happen, we don't have to take to the streets. We don't have to protest. There's laws on the books that already, support individuals that have been wrongfully killed at the hands of law enforcement.
And what do you think is the most efficient path right now to achieving that mission for justice?
I don't know. I'm not sure of the most efficient path, but what I would say is I think what's happening right now in the streets must continue. You have people that are constantly organizing and causing attention, because if we wasn't in the streets and we stayed home, there would not be this question of why are they out there. There would not be this mass media that is covering New York City, Dallas, Texas, St. Louis, Missouri, and so many other cities, Chicago, that are stepping up and saying we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, and we're not leaving until something change. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not sure about the most effective way, but I think as long as we keep putting pressure on the powers to be, on the system, that leaders in place, even including myself, will have to answer and will have to respond. When I go back to session in January, the General Assembly will have to say, we don't want another George Floyd or Mike Brown. So what policies can we make? And what's really cool now from the Ferguson movement to where we currently are is you have a lot of young people in different positions. We're just not protesting no more. Some of us have moved from protest to politics, including myself and Councilwoman Fran Griffin in Ferguson, who is also a leader of the Expect Us group that's been out there, but now she's a councilwoman that can enact policy. We're at the table, and we wasn't at the table at first. We were just on the menu, and we were screaming outside trying to get to the table. You have young people that have now created organizations, if it's Action Council or other organizations that they're over with the ACLU, where they're saying these are the policy changes that is needed. So I think as long as we don't stay complacent and we don't stay silent, as much movement and we're working in coordination now than we really ever have during Ferguson. Like I say, we've been able to build an infrastructure. All of the young people that are in different areas are working together to figure out how do we make the policy change. We're working with our elders in the community to figure out how do we create that policy change. So as long as we continue to move forward and not just go home and let business be as usual, I think that ultimately, we have ideas on like things that we could do. Like I said, if it's defunding the police or closing the workhouse in the city of St. Louis or banning chokeholds or looking at the use of force policy and making sure that, officers can't just say they're always fearful of their life and then use of force. And then we see these images now due to cell phones and body cameras that it doesn't really look like they were fearful of their life or wasn't even in danger if it was, i.e. George Floyd or so many others. So I would say the best way to create it, and we'll be able to look 5 years down the line and say, was that effective or not, and look at it and be able to revamp it and do it better, but is not giving up and continue to put pressures on the powers to be that can ultimately change the system that is in place, that is only meant to work the way it's been working. But we know the way that it's been working hasn't been equal and equitable for everybody.
And I know that you were a big part of the Ferguson movement in 2014. And from your experience, did our country make any progress in these 6 years, be it in terms of policy or in terms of executing any other solution?
I think our country, and also speaking here in Missouri for the statewide and also locally, you have seen small incremental change and progress, but the reality is it has not been dramatic enough where people can really say they feel that policy change. I know here in Ferguson area, which I don't reside in, but have been very active. They were finally able to get the federal government to come in and do a consent decree. Just recently, they elected the first African American mayor, female mayor, Ella Jones. And during the Ferguson movement, you've seen the federal government coming in, talking to young people on ideas and things that can get changed. You've seen on the statewide SB Senate Bill 5 that was then carried by who's now our Attorney General, Eric Schmidt, that proposed legislation that would help during this timing. But the reality is it hasn't been enough. We took the moment in death of Mike Brown to say we need to do something, and we made a little bit of change, and then we went back to business as usual. Going to my first session in the General Assembly, we passed the bill, but it has not been signed by the governor yet, and hopefully it won't. But we passed a House bill and the Senate Bill 600, that ultimately would increase money going to public safety, that would increase penalties and not reform the criminal justice system, that would actually build 2 new prisons instead of looking at ways that we can rehabilitate people. So there has been small incremental steps that have been taken from Ferguson, but somewhere along the line, it didn't continue to go far enough. And I think that's why, not just in Minneapolis, you see young people in St. Louis organizing again every day. You see young people that were angry during Ferguson, was too young to step up, now leading marches and sometimes having massive numbers, more numbers than your kind of status quo organization. I know the Parkway rally was so big that took place this last weekend. The weekend before that in the city of St. Louis, high school students, where you had about 20,000 people in the city of St. Louis, take to the street. And those are like huge numbers, and those are being done by young folks. So to your question, have we seen some change? I think so. The Ferguson Commission report was released, that was created during the Ferguson time in which I sat on, and you've seen some recommendations that had appetite, but you haven't really seen enough be enacted. So there's been small change, but it has not been the systematic change that we need, where people feel like, we don't need to take to the streets. And when a deadly situation happens, we have policies to stand on. And it's bigger than also criminal justice reform. You're talking, like I say, education, healthcare, economic rights for people in communities that don't have the same opportunities to thrive as people in Clayton, Missouri. So we have to do a lot more if we want to get to a place that we want to say everyone can say St. Louis is a place they love to live and be, and not just existing, but actually feel like that they're part of the St. Louis community, feel like they're part of the Missouri community. So we haven't done enough yet.
And during these difficult times of pandemic and racial unrest, we have seen our community come together in several different ways. And there are many more that continue to ask what we can be doing during these times. So can you tell us your top 3 powerful, actionable items that one can do to end racism and help restore justice?
Yeah, so one thing we always said in the Ferguson movement is everyone has a role to play. If you are the chant leader and a loud mouth like myself that get on the bullhorn, or if you're a medic where you make sure people stay safe, or you're a legal observer where you're watching the crowd and taking notes down for if any lawsuits were to come, or any things that we can use that say our First Amendment right was being violated. What I would tell people is, one, don't be silent and be complacent. If you see racism, and we all know what racism is, we know what it looks like, we know what it sounds like, we know the key words, even when someone says, oh, you're very articulate for your age, or you're very articulate for the way that you talk. Check that and be unapologetic with it. We're in different spaces. If you're a teacher, if you are a police officer, if you are in a boardroom, if you're with corporations, we're all in different spaces. And when you see and you hear racism, call it out and say, this isn't what's right, and not let it continue to stick by, and not continue to just let it be the norm. Oh, that was a funny joke. Words matter, and words, words can really change the way people feel about things. And if you let people feel comfortable around racism and racist words and actions, that will become their new norm. So, call out racism at any time. I would say, we need to be, especially for young people, we need to be thinking about, how do we run for office? If it's school board, if it's local races, if it's your state rep, I'm here to give as much advice as possible as a young person that has went through the gauntlet and still in the gauntlet and still trying to fight. But even if it's not elected office, if it's running your own organization, if it's you going to college and being part of an organization and becoming in leadership, and to create policies on that university or within your community that fights back against racism, that directly would have outcomes on when racism, because it's always going to live and breathe through. But how do we make sure that there's precautions and there's barriers where racism and racist things and racist people at times can be held accountable? So think about running for office. Also, like I say, speak out against racism and every time that you can. And I would say this is more advice for the ones who sometimes don't feel oppressed, that are not of color, that have privilege. You know, it's your duty as well to be able to stand in solidarity as an ally, as a brother, as a sister, as a comrade, whatever words you want to, with people that are speaking out, and not to push back on their reality, because their reality is genuine. It is real, and is what folks like myself and folks like you of color go through on a day-to-day basis. If it's, you know, our sexual orientation or our religion or the community that we're currently living in that's different from others. You know, for my allies out there that has been doing a great job showing up from Ferguson, and even since the George Floyd, really showing up, putting their bodies on the line, speaking out, but remembering to check their privilege and remembering to not get to a point because it's not their reality that they don't believe it. And if they have questions, ask the people who reality is, why, you know, do you feel like that? Why do you say that? And listen and follow Black leadership in this moment. It's not that we know best and we all have to work together, just like during the civil rights movement. It's going to take all races, it's going to take all religion, it's going to take all ages and all sexual orientations to make a difference. But you must lift up and understand the voices that have been oppressed the most when they're talking about some of these policy change that they want to see in their community that they feel like can help the whole world. You must listen to them when they're talking about the pain and hurt of what it means to be Black in America, what it means to be a Muslim in America, what it means to be a person of color in America, and to stand in solidarity side by side as we look at the movement, not behind us, because we're all families side by side, but not in front of us. Don't take this moment for your own privilege or righteousness and feel like this is what I should be doing best. Take the time to ask ones that you really care about the most that's being affected by this, how you can be a help, how you can be an ally and help out in these ways.
And going back to your point about everyone sort of playing their part and everyone playing a role in this movement, what would your message to America be, and how can everyone play their role and be a part of the solution?
I think it would kind of go back to what I said before, is not being complacent and silent. One of the things we say out at the protest, silence is violence. We know everyone's not going to be a protester. Or we know everyone's not going to be able to, either if it's because of physically can't be able to walk miles. We have a lot of people that suffer with mental health and can't be out there mentally because it gets triggers and bring them back, right? So just because you can't be out in the streets, we all are all in different spaces where we can continue to check racism, where we can continue to push policy, where we continue to push back. If it's a young person like the ones at Parkway that are saying, you know, we want our policies to be changed here in the Parkway area. We want our racial and cultural policies to really be addressed when we're talking about racism in our schools. We want school board leaders that look like us. There's no person of color out there. So what I would tell everyone, either in Missouri or across the world, that's like, how do I help out? Reach out to organizations that's doing the work and see what best way you can be help. If you are a superintendent or if you're a teacher, and once again, if you hear racism or you see racism that is existing in your workplace, check it. Not just check it, call it out and figure out how do you make change so that that doesn't happen again. We all have a duty and a role to play in making sure that this world is fair and that people feel like it's equitable for everyone. You sometimes have to figure that out. I can help you, but I can't tell you to be a protester. I can't tell you to be an activist. I can't tell you to be a state rep. What I can tell you to do is not be silent, and whatever best way that you feel like you can implement change if it's through the private sector, the non-private sector, if it's through community organizing, if it's through running for office, or even if it's just having a conversation with your family at the dinner table. That's how we start to make the change in our communities. And when we don't be silent to the violence that is taking place against Black people, against people of color, against Black trans individuals, when we don't be silent and we start educating and informing each other on the reality that people of color and ones that are being oppressed want the world to live in, I think that's how we start to continue to have this bubble up where ultimately it creates like a volcano and it explodes where it's time to create reform, where it's time to be at the table for policy change and many other things. So my advice would be, just don't be silent to these issues that are taking place. Don't be silent when you hear folks out there chanting livable wages and they're advocating for $15 an hour. Don't be silent when people are saying that, the education system in the city of St. Louis is way different than Ladue and Kirkwood and Parkway. And don't be silent when there's statistics and facts and data out there about what it means to be a person of color in America, what it means to be able to live in a community where you're heavily policed, or when we see these killings between law enforcement and people of color and there's no accountability happen. And the notion we always like to talk about Black on Black crime, there's so much into that that is way different. And then law enforcement being not held accountable when they kill a person of color compared to when people of color kill each other, and they're held accountable for as jail and prison or whatever. So this is not the moment to sit on our hands and say, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. There's plenty of organizations, there's plenty of leaders out there, there's plenty of young people that would be willing to have a conversation of their lived experiences that could be able to help you make a difference. Not you personally, but to people that want to make a difference in their community, in their state, and across this whole country.
Representative Aldrich, we thank you so much for taking the initiative to strengthen and serve our community, both through policymaking and being a critical part of this movement. And we thank you so much for your service and for your time today, as well as answering all of our questions.
I appreciate it. And I just want to, once again, thank you and thank all the young people, because at my age, when I was in Parkway, I wasn't super active. It took for me after high school, which is, fine. But, to see so many young people like yourself, so many young people in Parkway, so many young people across this whole world that are now stepping up and gaining their voice and saying, hey, just because I'm a young person, I have a voice in the way I want my community to look. It's inspiring to me as a young person to see other young people out there. So we have a duty and an obligation as young people to step up. And even when they tell us that we shouldn't be there or that we're too inexperienced, don't let that be on you. Don't let that hold you back. Continue to push back. So thank you for all that you're doing. And thank you to all the young people that are stepping up and saying we want to see a world where we can also live in and be treated fairly if you're a color or if you're not, and you know that your friends are being oppressed and being treated differently than what you are. So thank you so much for having me.